Welcome to our History Channel.
Okay, forget the dry, dusty history lessons you might remember from middle school. In this explainer, we're plunging straight into a massive, terrifying crisis on the open ocean. We're going to look at a journey that literally reshaped the globe, but we're looking at it through a slightly different lens today, a life-threatening mathematical era.
Right, so picture this scenario. You've been stuck in the absolute middle of the Atlantic Ocean for over 2 months. Your food, it's running out. Your drinking water is literally turning sour. There's just zero land in sight. And worse, the very men you're supposed to be leading are whispering about, throwing you into the dark water. It sounds like a movie plot, right? But this was the incredibly real, high-stakes situation Christopher Columbus faced in the autumn of 1492. He was commanding what was supposed to be a straightforward mission, but instead, he found himself trapped with spoiling food, bad water, and a highly mutinous crew.
Section 1. A desperate search for riches.
So, to understand how Columbus actually ended up in this claustrophobic nightmare, we kind of have to look back at the world he came from. Specifically, we've got to look at Europe's desperate, all-consuming obsession with finding a direct sea route to the incredible wealth of Asia. Growing up in Genoa, Italy, Columbus was completely captivated by the sea and these wild tales of exotic markets. Back then, goods like pepper, cinnamon, silk, they had to travel thousands of miles over incredibly treacherous land routes before they ever hit a European market. It was a logistical nightmare. European kingdoms were practically begging for a shortcut. Now, Columbus knew the Earth was round. Honestly, most educated people of his time did, so his plan wasn't completely out of left field. The logic was super straightforward. If you just keep sailing continuously west, you'll eventually wrap around the globe and bump right into Asia from the opposite direction.
Section 2. The math was completely wrong.
The basic theory of sailing west was fine, but here's the catch. The execution relied on some deeply, wildly flawed numbers. Columbus vastly underestimated the actual size of the Earth. He thought the globe was way, way smaller than it is, and he had absolutely no clue that a massive landmass, the Americas, was standing directly in his way. He was dead wrong about the distance, but as we'll see, he was about to get incredibly lucky with what he actually bumped into.
Because his math was so far off, getting this trip funded was an absolute nightmare. First, he pitches the Portuguese court. Their navigation experts take one look at his numbers, spot the exact miscalculation we just talked about, and reject the whole thing as completely suicidal. But Columbus, he was nothing if not persistent. He shopped this idea from court to court, until finally in 1492, Spain's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella decided to just roll the dice. They gave him roughly 90 men and 3 ships you probably recognize, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña.
Section 3. Terror on the open ocean.
All right, let's look at the voyage itself, because this is where it turns into a real psychological thriller. They leave Spain on August 3, 1492. At first, it's great. Strong winds are pushing them steadily west, spirits are high. But then, days turn into weeks. The horizon is just completely empty. Every single morning, just water. Every night, the terrifying pitch-black darkness of the open ocean. The bread turns rock hard, the meat spoils, and real panic starts setting in. It got so bad that Columbus actually started faking the daily distance logs. Yeah, he gave the crew a smaller estimate of how far they'd traveled, just so they wouldn't realize how incredibly deep into the unknown they really were. And to make things even more tense, they sailed into these bizarre, thick patches of floating seaweed, making the guys think they'd be stuck there forever. Oh, and their compasses started acting erratic. For a 15th century sailor, a broken compass is literally your worst nightmare.
So these whispers of doubt, they turn into arguments. And those arguments quickly escalate to the absolute brink of rebellion. By early October, the situation was completely desperate. The crew essentially gives Columbus an ultimatum: turn these ships around right now. With an outright mutiny brewing, Columbus actually begs his men for a compromise. He asks for just a few more days. If they don't see land in that tiny window, he promises he'll turn back. It is, frankly, staggering to think about. That brief, desperate delay, just pleading for a little more time, literally altered global history forever.
Section 4. The unexpected discovery.
Right at the very end of that terrifying countdown, the whole vibe on the ships drastically shifts. The experienced sailors start spotting these undeniable clues floating past them in the water. First, it's a fresh, green branch bobbing on the waves. Then, a carved piece of wood. Finally, they see birds flying overhead. Now, for guys who hadn't seen anything but empty, terrifying ocean for weeks, these weren't just random objects. This was an absolute guarantee that land was right there. That agonizing ticking clock of their dwindling supplies, it finally stopped, and hope just surged right back through the fleet.
And then, the moment happens. During the night of October 11th, someone spots a mysterious light in the distance. A few hours later, in the early morning of October 12th, a sailor aboard the Pinta stares out into the horizon and shouts the one word everyone was completely desperate to hear: land. After more than 2 grueling months at sea, they had actually made it.
Section 5. Two worlds collide.
Columbus steps onto the shore of a Caribbean island and, in his mind, proudly claims it for Spain. He genuinely believed he had hit the islands just off the coast of Asia, which is exactly why he called the local indigenous people Indians, a label based entirely on his completely mistaken belief that he'd reached the Indies. Now, it's crucial that we look impartially at the grim reality of what followed this contact. This arrival absolutely opened the floodgates for European exploration and trade, but it brought catastrophic, truly devastating consequences for the indigenous societies of the Americas. The historical record is incredibly clear here. This contact led directly to severe warfare, systemic exploitation, mass displacement, and the introduction of deadly diseases that decimated populations.
We have to understand that millions of indigenous people had already been living across the Americas for thousands and thousands of years. So Columbus didn't discover a blank slate or some empty continent. What actually happened was a chaotic, entirely accidental collision. His voyage instantly connected 2 massively complex worlds that had previously been completely isolated from one another by the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean.
And honestly, this brings us to the ultimate mind-bending irony of Christopher Columbus's life. Despite the monumental global impact of his journey, he went to his grave never actually comprehending the true geographic reality of what he had found. He spent the rest of his life stubbornly convinced he had successfully found that new sea route to Asia. He was wrong about the distance, he was totally wrong about reaching India, but just through sheer luck, he was accidentally right that sailing west would eventually lead to land.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to consider the wild chain of events we just mapped out. A man desperately searching for India, armed with genuinely terrible math, just stumbles into a completely different hemisphere. Think about how one massive mistake on a navigator's chart birthed a dramatic new chapter in human history. It's a legacy filled with intense ambition and discovery for sure, but also one that left a lasting footprint of enormous conflict and profound tragedy. The 1492 voyage wasn't just a boat trip, you guys. It was the spark that rewired the entire globe. What do you think would have happened if his math had actually been right? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the history you think you know.